We're going to have a discussion about the Proposal 1 question that voters are going to be confronted with on November 8th. This has to do with term limits and financial disclosure. And joining me in MERS World Headquarters, first of all, Speaker of the House, former Speaker of the House, Jase Bolger. He's the co-chair of Voters for Transparency and Term Limits. And then also joining me is Scott Tillman. He is the National Field Director of U.S. Term Limits, but he's here today in his capacity as the Committee Treasurer for No More Time for Career Politicians. Thanks for joining me, guys.
Thank you, Kyle.
All right, well, let's start with you, Jason. We'll talk about the problem that Proposal 1 is designed to solve.
I think the first and foremost, it's financial disclosure. So financial disclosure is something that's been discussed in Lansing for at least a decade, but not achieved. And so this is the people coming forward and saying they will have their voice heard on this to put into our Constitution a requirement that there's financial disclosure for our statewide elected officials, the executive office, so the governor, the attorney general, the secretary of state, as well as the legislature. The people deserve the right to know where their elected officials have their interests, so they can then judge, are those elected officials standing up for the people's interests?
So now some would say then that this financial disclosure piece is window dressing for the real reason for this proposal, which is to extend term limits in the State House.
I would point to the fact that this has been discussed for at least 10 years in Lansing and has not been achieved. So it's finally time to get this job done. And Michigan is one of only 2 states that doesn't have financial disclosure requirements. The people deserve that transparency from their elected officials. It's time that they get that. And with a yes vote, they will get that. And I would say with a no vote, they'd get the status quo. A no vote would continue the lack of transparency for voters to have here in Michigan.
Scott, what's wrong with financial transparency?
Absolutely nothing, and I'm 100% in favor of it. Could have been passed with a simple majority vote of the legislature any time for the last 10 years, including the day they passed this with 2/3 majority in both House and Senate. Everybody's in favor of transparency. This one is good, needs more teeth, but this isn't here about the transparency. This is here to disguise the scam that lies underneath, which is going after to weaken Michigan's term limits. The whole measure is designed to weaken Michigan's term limits. The only reason that transparency hasn't passed over the years is because the legislature hasn't felt the need to go and do this, and they're only putting it on today as window dressing to cover up their fraud, their deceit that they're pulling on the people of the state of Michigan.
Scam and deceit, these are strong words. Where do those come from?
There is absolutely, like I mentioned, this could have passed with a simple majority. That day that they passed this, they had no debate. They ran this under the... there was no public posting of this on the website or anything like that. The only thing that has been talked about by them is the transparency. If you look at the ads that they're running, the transparency is, while good, not very strong. And the real meat and potatoes of this is term limits, because term limits is the part that needs a constitutional amendment. The rest of this doesn't need a constitutional amendment. If you look at the way that it's passed, the actual nuts and bolts and teeth of this will be decided in a future legislative session. There's really nothing to the transparency portion. I am very much in favor of transparency. I think we want more transparency in our government. I think we need something with much stronger transparency. But this is all about the term limits, and this is totally a fraud.
I find it ironic to hear deceit and hiding coming from my colleague here, who has been guilty of campaign finance violations already for not disclosing the information that they were supposed to. So this is about the people deserving the right to know where their legislators have their financial interests so that they can judge how they're performing their job.
You just accused me of a very serious thing. Someone has alleged that I have a campaign finance.
I'll use allegedly.
Decided that I was
right,
guilty
I'll
of
amend
that.
to say allegedly.
It's very easy to file a complaint, but I have not been convicted. And I stand by and say that we have not misreported anything. So to come on here and tell people over the air that I have somehow committed fraud, that's very insulting.
So let's talk about what is this that is accused here in this complaint, Jase?
That they didn't follow campaign finance laws, that they didn't disclose the things that they were supposed to disclose. It is, at this point, a complaint. However, he was using language that you asked him to respond to, and so I noted that it was awfully ironic that he was throwing that kind of language around at others when he's been accused of actual violations.
So what happened in this particular case here?
What happened in this case?
Yeah, what happened in this case about the campaign finance disclosure and this complaint?
The League of Women Voters apparently thinks that I can't act in my personal capacity to defend Michigan's term limits or speak out in favor of it, and they think that because I also am part of an organization, U.S. Term Limits, that somehow any time that I spend on that has to be reported as a donation from U.S. Term Limits, and they claim that the horse that I built back in 2011 and personally own somehow belongs to U.S. Term Limits and is having money spent on advertising and things, and it's totally false.
So where is this coming from, do you believe?
Where is it coming from? People want to make hay of something other than the topic of term limits, which this is about. People want anything other than term limits. They want to talk about transparency that's toothless. They want to talk about campaign finance things. Let's talk about term limits, which is what this initiative is really about.
Well, let's talk about term limits then, Jase, because really at its core, this is about giving legislators 6 more years in the House, isn't it? Because as it stands right now, what functionally happens is that you get legislators who serve either 4 or 6 years in the House, then they make a bid for the Senate. Some of them get through, some of them don't. But in the end, the House becomes the minor leagues for the Senate because the Senate gets all the experienced people and the House just gets by with the people off the street.
Listen, I supported term limits. I still support term limits. I firmly believe this strengthens term limits. The reason I say that is at least twofold. I think there are a couple of unintended consequences to the term limits that we have in place. First, it shifted power to the unelected bureaucracy. The people's voice was diminished. If you've got a problem, you've got a challenge with a tax collector, with a regulator, with a permitter, that bureaucrat has more power because they've got much longer lifespan today than the legislature does. So what do the people do? The people call their elected official and ask for them to advocate on their behalf. What happens today, too often, is that bureaucrat just ignores the people's voice and pushes right on by doing what they wish to do with regard to their rules or their enforcement without regard for the law, or again, without regard for the people's voice. So this, I think, would shift that power back to the people. The second is the current term limit structure said you can serve longer, but only if you run for another job. And I think what people wanted in term limits is they wanted people, citizen legislators, to go do the job that they were elected to do, focus on the job that they were elected to do, and then return home and live under the rules that they had just created. I think the unintended consequence of saying you can serve longer, but only if you run for another job, is that today too many people start looking too quickly for that next job. It therefore rewards them from not doing the job that they've got, but instead to look for that next job. So what this does is it shortens the total time that somebody could serve in the legislature. Today, somebody can serve 14 years in the legislature. If this passes, they could only serve 12.
Scott, now one of the jokes in the Capitol is that if you're a state House member, if you serve in the House, you get 3 terms. The first term, you're figuring out what the heck you're supposed to do. The second term, you actually do it. And the third year, your third term, you're finding your new job. You could argue that this proposal would actually give people 4 terms to do their job.
4 terms. Where do you get that number?
Well, because if you get 6 terms in the House, let's say 6 terms for 12 years, the first term you're figuring out what you're doing, and then the last term you're figuring out what you're going to do next. But in the meantime, you got 4 terms to actually do the job as a state legislator, so you actually get somebody who's got a little bit more experience, and you get a more experienced House under this proposal.
Let me tell you what they get experience doing. First term, when somebody runs for office, typically they're putting in a big chunk of their own money when they run, and they're getting a lot of money from friends and family back home. The second time somebody runs for office, they don't put in any of their own money, unless something has gone really drastically wrong and they're under indictment or something. They still get money from friends and family back home, but most of the money comes in from Lansing special interest. The third time around, an even greater amount comes from Lansing special interest, and less comes from back home. And by the 4th time, when people are running then for Senate, or when you look at Congress and other places and other states, by the time somebody's running for the 4th and future, it's all special interest money coming in. So who are they representing once they get past those 3 terms? The first 3 terms are very connected to their constituency. But 4 terms and on, now they're representing special interest. Now, Mr. Bolger said something that is kind of insulting to anybody who actually looks at the numbers of this. He said that this is going to reduce time. The Citizens Research Council, which is not somebody who's in favor of term limits, they came out today with a study that showed that over 89% of the people who have been in the legislature will be able to come back. So this is not, and only 6% wouldn't be. So this is not something that's anyway reducing time for people. This is letting the vast, vast majority, 89% compared to 6%, come back. That's huge.
Jase, let's address one of these issues here. Scott brought up that this was seen as possibly self-serving. You, for example, could go back and serve in the House if this were to pass. I'm
not running. I've told you before. I like my life and I love my wife. However, Let's entertain your hypothetical.
Sure.
If I were to run, I could run for 8 years today. If this passed, I could only run for 6 years. It shortens and strengthens term limits. 12 is less than 14. 6 is less than 8.
Okay, Scott he's got a point there,
It's
right? I mean, 12 is less than
correct
14.
that a Senate term is longer than a House term, and he could run for, 2 more times under the current system, but under the new system, he'd be able to run for 3 more times. So he'd be able to run for more elections. And yes, he's out now in a cushy lobbyist position, paid lobbyist. What happens when people leave
Excuse me, sir. You just, a specific term,
Yeah.
you used paid lobbyist. I do not lobby.
Then who went and got the legislature to put this on the ballot? Because the people on your
I'm
committee
not
said
paid.
that you guys have gone
I
and
am
done
not
this.
paid.
So you do this all out of the kindness of your heart, and
Yes.
you're not collecting any salary whatsoever from this?
No.
Nobody's doing any contributions for your time or anything like that?
No, show me anything to the contrary. Talk about wild and
I don't know.
baseless
Maybe you guys
accusations.
maybe you guys aren't reporting it. The same thing I've been accused of.
No, I am not.
All right.
Show me anything to the contrary.
But
I'll have to look it up.
But to Scott's point, though, he is talking about special interest influence, and he mentioned that when it comes time for campaign donations. Does he have a point in that regard, that folks come to the legislature pure in that they have been financed by their constituents, but by the time they leave, they are beholden to the lobbyists and the friends and the special interests that they've made friends with over the years?
I would note again, he's defending having 14 years instead of this change to 12 years. I would add that U.S. term limits is advocated for, and I'm really disappointed that they haven't focused on their job and gotten it done, term limits at the U.S. congressional level. There, they argue, 12 years is the right number of years for the U.S. Senate. But when you talk about somebody, how long they could run or how often they could run, the point is they're ultimately the answer to the people. And I think when people show up today in their first day on the job, many cases, you cover it here in Lansing, it's their first time in that committee. Now, if the bureaucracy comes forward, they don't even know yet what questions to ask that bureaucracy. So that's why I believe firmly that this would return power to people and remove it from those unelected bureaucrats. That's the shift that would happen.
Well, what's wrong with that argument, Scott? I see his point.
That argument is wrong and that it's false.
Well,
it doesn't
I have
read-
seen this, though. I've seen situations where bureaucrats just wait for a particular committee chair to leave. They can wait him out or wait her out. They know that they're only going to serve 2 more terms, and boom, they're gone.
The bureaucrats serve at the pleasure of the legislature and at the executive. And if we don't have term limits, then they're buddy-buddy with the legislators. We don't have to look very far. We can look to Washington, D.C., we can look to Indiana, we can look to Illinois, we can look to Wisconsin. And you see what it's like when you don't have term limits. And the legislators don't push back against the bureaucracy at all. So yes, in Michigan, some legislators get thwarted by the bureaucrats when they push back, but I'd rather have some legislators pushing back than all the legislators just going along like they do in Illinois.
How do the bureaucrats work for the legislature? How can the legislature get rid of a bureaucrat?
You're the speaker.
I am not.
You were the former
I
speaker.
was. You just made the claim. I've asked you to explain it.
I'm sorry.
You said
were
the
introduced as Mr. Former Speaker, so sorry for
Well, no,
if that
but-
was insulting. I apologize.
But no, to the point on
the
legislators. The point on legislators, though,
how
having
legislators,
influence
how
on.
bureaucrats work for legislators was your claim. I'm asking you to explain why that's why.
They're supposed to. They're supposed to report. The legislature is supposed to oversee the bureaucratic agencies. The governor can appoint lots, hiring, that kind of stuff, and the legislature is tasked with oversight.
And again, and then as Kyle pointed out, you've got legislators showing up their first day on the job, chairing a committee. That bureaucrat has been in office for 10 years, been in that office for 10 years. The legislature just gets started, they start playing hide the peanut. It takes a couple of meetings.
Have you been following what's going on in Illinois with how their legislator has been gaming the system, and ComEd down there, the electric company, has been, really soaking it to the taxpayers? Because the bureaucrats and the legislatures are in cahoots and in it together, and because of no term limits, the people who have been in charge for 20 or 30 years.
I know you're here on behalf of a Washington, D.C. based organization, but we're talking about Michigan and what's going on.
We're talking about Michigan. Do you want Michigan to be more like Illinois or California?
Financial disclosure.
But Jase, we could also argue that even if you're serving 6 years, 12 years in the state house, as that committee chair, you don't have to fund that department. If they come in and insult you, you can say, hey, you know what? we're going to defund your department 30% until you shape up.
They ultimately have the power of the purse, but that's the entire department. That's the entire function that you're talking about, not a specific bureaucrat, as my colleague was trying to
You want to make
convey.
Michigan politics more like Washington, D.C. politics, where people can stay there longer and build up relationships and little fiefdoms where they kind of run
I don't
things.
get any
And
check
yes,
from Washington, D.C.
when
nor
they
any
leave, they
Washington,
can get
D.C.
a
organization.
Cushy
I wish
paid
you'd get
position
your job
working
done at the
lobbyist.
federal level.
Hey, we're
I
working
support,
on it.
You've been working
We
on
don't
it.
have the initiative
Been
and
billing
referendum
a lot of people
at the
for a lot of
national
time
level.
and not gotten it done.
Well, Jase, though, to Scott's point, though, as far as special interest, this proposal is supported by folks who are special interests in Lansing, you could argue. The chamber, the unions, they all are in support of this.
It is supported by people all across the aisle, all across the spectrum. People who have come forward and said, Michigan needs a change. We don't
The
like
biggest
the status
lobbyists
quo.
in
Hold
the
on,
state.
let him finish here, Scott.
They have been clear that they don't want the status quo, and they want change. They want financial disclosure for the citizens, for the benefit of the citizens, to have that clarity with regard to their elected officials. And they want to strengthen term limits and make sure that somebody can only serve 12 years in the legislature, but remove the unintended consequence to encourage them to look for running for their next job.
Very ironic that this is called strengthening term limits when for the last 20 years in Michigan you've had the chamber, the union, the different unions, as well as the bureaucrats in Michigan rail against the term limits. And then now all of a sudden this is proposed, this strengthening of term limits, and who are the main supporters? The chamber, all the special interest lobbyist groups that have for years opposed term limits and wanted them outright ended. And now they're big supporters of you. I mean, come on. That's nobody's buying that.
Okay, but who is the supporters of the term limits, folks? You guys have been around for a long time. Who's been bankrolling this organization over the years?
We go out and raise money through donations. I mean, we go and talk to donors and say, hey, this is the program that we're working on or trying to get passed. We're working on Article 5 efforts in all the states, well, a majority of the states. And we work on, state term limits on occasionally. But for the most part, we are pushing congressional term limits. We're working on Article 5 resolutions, which is a whole thing on its own. If you want to get into that, we can. But it's not exactly what we're doing here in Michigan.
Okay, so you're basically the grassroots. Okay, well, let me address a different issue here. I'm just looking at the Citizens Research Council report here. They noticed that both California and Arkansas instituted term limits right about the same time as Michigan, but they've actually rolled back and expanded their term limits a little bit and presented that to the people, and that's what the people wanted. What's wrong with presenting it to the people now here in Michigan to do basically the same thing?
Well, Kyle, you're here in the same interview that I'm in, and you've heard Jase try to drive this conversation back towards transparency, and avoid term limits as much as he can. When those things passed in California and in Arkansas, they were outright deceptions. The Arkansas thing amended multiple different places in their constitution and has a footnote. This was their footnote. Establish term limits in the legislature. Not change term limits in the legislature, not extend term limits, but establish term limits in the legislature. So people went in there, saw a whole bunch of flowery fluff on term limit or transparency, just like what they're seeing here. And then there's a note at the end that this is going to give them term limits. It was an outright fraud and deception, and the same thing in California.
Is that your understanding of what happened?
The people should absolutely decide this issue. We've said from the start, when we announced this coalition in March, we said there's only one way to change term limits. That's to change the Constitution. There's only one way to change the Constitution. That's a vote of the people. That's exactly how it should be. Now, there's two ways to get it to the people. There's a petition process, which we kicked off, and we said right away that we're also going to talk to the legislature, and we're going to ask the legislature to put it forward. They did, and now the decision rests exactly where it should, and that's the people of the state of Michigan.
The biggest financier when they put this on was a gentleman from New York who owns the Miami Dolphins. He put up the money for the initial petition drive, and then later the legislature put this on the ballot, and then they gave him a huge giveaway down in Detroit for a $100 million center to be built, or taxpayer giveaway down there. Stevens got. It's ridiculous. There was no posting about this online. This was totally under the cover of darkness. It wasn't posted anywhere where any citizen could have seen it prior to being voted on the floor in the House. And then it wasn't even posted as it was being voted on. It was posted later that day after it had been voted on and passed in the House and the Senate. The transparency portion of this is entirely, I'm not opposed to it, and nothing is going to change that it would be a good thing. But this is all about that disguising what they're doing to term limits. When you look at the numbers of people who, and ask them, do you support Michigan's term limits? Very, very high, 70, 80%. Do you want to change Michigan's term limits? No, they don't. But then you throw this in, you put transparency in term limits, and you don't ask them if they like the Michigan term limits currently, it's a deception. The only reason they're putting this all together is to trick people. People don't realize that in Michigan we have good term limits, the best term limits in the country, and this is totally designed to be a fraud, to be a deceit, to be a scam, to trick those people. Trick voters.
I find it really funny to watch him claim that this was a surprise. Again, we held a public press conference. We announced that we were kicking this off.
Yeah, but when the House and the Senate passed this thing, though, that was they did ram that thing through, though.
I've served in the majority and I've served in the minority, and here's what I saw: when you have the votes, you vote, and when you don't, you whine about the process.
And they had the votes, so they went ahead and did it. Have you heard from legislators, current or past, who are interested in seeing this pass so they can continue serving?
No, not a one. Because most of them that he's talking about could run today. Again, I'm not going to run, but let's talk about my situation. I could absolutely run for 8 more years.
Oh man,
so
it got deep in here.
Changing this has nothing to do with the ability to run.
You don't think that anybody who's out wants to serve again? You haven't heard from any of them.
I answered his question honestly and completely.
I mean, that is
nobody.
Deep, man. It's getting knee deep in this office. People.
Ask him the same question.
Okay, how many legislators? Just give me a rough percentage. How many do you think will continue?
No, ask him the same. Who have said they're going to run again because if this passes?
Okay, we'll start with that one. Then we'll get to my other one. Have you heard from legislators who say they're going to run again if this passes?
I don't spend my time talking to legislators. Legislators oppose
no
term
is the
limits.
answer
well,
to
that's
your
actually
question,
why
Kyle.
I didn't ask that question, because I figured that was the answer.
But no is the answer to your question.
But let's
I'm
ask
not a
this
lobbyist.
question.
I mean,
neither
I'm
am
not.
I.
Well, he's not a registered lobbyist, but he is advocating for somebody. We can say that. But let's talk about the legislators who would conceivably continue on their service in the House. Just a rough percentage. How many do you think will continue on for a 4th term if this passes?
Oh, I think the vast majority of them who are currently serving will continue on and run for a 4th term.
Okay, and then you got to imagine that it'll just be a handful of people who try and come back and run again, don't you?
I think they'll come back and run again when seats open up. That's what we saw in Arkansas, and California. They'll come back.
But what's wrong with that, though? I mean, now they've been back with the people. I mean, they're not buddy-buddy with the lobbyists anymore.
Okay. What term limits does is it breaks up the power of incumbency. Okay. When you run for office and you serve in that position and you have that experience, you can go out and raise money from the special interest groups who want the legislation that you're passing. You also learn how to run a really good campaign. Just because you learn how to run a really good campaign doesn't mean you're of the people. It means you know how to, win your party's nomination locally, which is normally decided by a small group of either Republicans or Democrats early in the cycle. Term limits is necessary to break up incumbent advantage. That's what it does. And it also breaks up relationships between legislators and lobbyists. That's what it does. That's why lobbyists hate it. That's why they'll take anything they can, including just give us just a few more years. That's all we want.
Let's talk about the financial transparency angle of this. Do you see the requirements as being overly stringent? And the reason I ask is because, as Scott mentioned, this could have been passed with a majority of the legislature and the governor's signature, and yet it's never has.
And that's exactly the point. It hasn't gotten done. So this would force them to do.
They had the votes, Jase. You said if they have the votes, they can put it out.
This would be a constitutional requirement that they have to disclose their financial interests. I think that's long overdue. I think it needs to be done, and this would force them to do that. And just like happens in any constitutional amendment, legislation will need to be enacted afterwards. So he talks about a time frame. The people have to enact this first. And then, yes, the legislature the next year would have to enact the details. That is exactly how the Constitution is handled. The Constitution is a skeleton, if you will, and then they put meat on the bones with legislation. But this has very strong minimum requirements. The public will know where somebody has their financial interests if this passes, and I think that was key.
Why hasn't this passed the legislature before, in your opinion?
It is I don't recall dealing with this issue when I was there. I don't remember it being, we had a financial crisis at that time. That's what I recall mostly dealing with. What I've observed since then is that everybody's got different ideas on how it ought to be done. And so this picks one and says that they have to hit these minimum requirements. They have to produce this information for the public.
Scott, if you could write up a financial disclosure law, how would it be different than what is in this proposal?
I'd give it some teeth. I'm not opposed to that portion of this.
Okay,
You
when
know,
you say
I'm
give
very
it some
much
teeth, what are you
I'm
talking
very
about?
much in favor of transparency. I think that the state's FOIA laws need to be strengthened. But specific to this, what could be strengthened? This exempts political work, political positions. These are all people who are working in political jobs and work with political parties and organizations and other things like that. Why is that exempted? That's laughable. For one thing, if I was designing it, it would include that. Michigan can go a long way when it comes to transparency, as can every other state. I don't care if you take the state that is the most transparent in our country. I think that they need to have open books. People need to be able to go online and see everything in real time. Everything needs to be open and available. That's how you're going to get honest reporting. That's how you're going to get honest legislators, when you shine lights on that stuff. One thing about Michigan, because we have these short-term limits, is you actually see the different what's the right term for it? I can't think of it. You see when there's a scandal, it comes to light much sooner. In places without term limits, like New York, like Illinois, they can run a game where they soak hundreds of millions or billions of dollars out of taxpayers. But in a state like Michigan, where you have term limits and people aren't dependent on the legislature, for their staff positions, somebody will go and expose two legislators having an affair. Somebody will expose this stuff right away. Somebody will expose the speaker, who recently left, doing things that are questionable fundraising-wise. Those things get exposed really quickly in places where you have term limits because they're not wedded to those politicians. Their entire career doesn't depend on those politicians. In places without term limits, like Illinois, they're unraveling a whole mess, but they've been, letting their electric company rob their taxpayers for decades because it was going into the pockets of other people. That's what happens when you don't have term limits. There's nobody to see.
And of course, we're not talking about not having term limits.
Yeah,
we're talking about strengthening term limits here in Michigan.
Well, about the financial disclosure aspect, he said that he'd add more teeth. Can you explain what kind of teeth are in this? Are we talking jail time here for people who don't report?
The finer details will need to be passed, as always happens when you put minimum requirements in a constitution. So there are the requirements, and you can read for yourself those the specific details about where they have their income, where they have their assets, what boards they serve on, any promises for future employment, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there's a lot of detail there that will allow the public to make their evaluation of, is this legislator representing the public, or do they have self-interests at play here?
But you could argue here that without any kind of concrete fines or jail time or something, somebody could take a look at these requirements and be like, yeah, that's nice.
But that's not what's in a constitutional amendment. Again, the constitutional amendment puts forth the framework. It doesn't have the details of a statute. So this
Kyle,
is
Michigan does
in line
need some
with how we-
transparency, and this, is where it should
So
start.
why are you advocating for no on financial disclosure?
I'm not advocating. I'm advocating for not extending our term limits.
So we
And
put you down as a yes?
You mentioned that the legislature could vote anytime they had the votes. Well, they had the votes that morning. They had many more votes than they needed for the transparency portion, but they didn't, because the transparency is just window dressing for what the legislature really wants to do, is give themselves more time in office. The Citizens Research Council said this morning that 89% of legislators would be able to come back for more time. Those are people that can come back. I don't know where you
Maybe
keep saying
if you
less.
support financial disclosure, if you'd gotten it done over the last decade, we wouldn't be here. We wouldn't be talking about it. But this is
I
finally
wasn't
stepping
Speaker
forward
of the House
and forcing them to do it.
less than a decade back. I wasn't Speaker of the House. I've been out working on what I advocate.
All right. So, Scott, if you were to draw a great financial disclosure law, would you include fines or jail time for politicians who decide they're not going to disclose or are not accurately disclosing?
I think both of those should be out. I'm a big advocate of 2 terms, 1 term in office, 1 term in prison. So,
so you would be okay with that?
I'd be okay with
real
that.
quick, would you be okay with what kind of fines and what kind of jail time do you think would be reasonable for people who don't follow?
I think the bottom line is you need accountability, and so I would be open to those details on how you craft that. But the point is, it certainly needs to be penalizing enough that people have to be clear, open, and honest with the financial disclosure that's required.
And maybe someday in the future we can actually get a piece of legislation that does that, because this one doesn't.
All right, if you guys can believe it, we've already exhausted 30 minutes, and I want to thank you both for coming in and arguing your points. Jase Bolger, former Speaker of the House, co-chair for Voters for Transparency and Term Limits, and Scott Tillman, who is the committee treasurer for No More Time for Career Politicians. A great discussion, guys. Appreciate you both coming in and talking about it.
Thank you, Kyle.